If I was to start scaling this page down though, what you'll see is that the repeating group will automatically collapse, as it can now only fit in the size of 2 groups on this page. And if I was to continually scale this down again, what you'll see is it will only fit in 1 card now. And if I continually scale this down as our menu on this page disappears, this repeating group will remain responsive at all times. Hello, my name is Lachlan Kirkwood, and today I'll be teaching you everything you need to know to master the new Flexbox responsive engine within Bubble's no-code platform. At the end of 2021, Bubble released the beta of their new responsive engine, which runs on the CSS Flexbox structure, and it completely revolutionized the way you can build responsive applications within Bubble's platform. And it also left me completely baffled, as I essentially had to relearn how to use the entire platform from scratch again. If you're anything like me, I'd spent the past couple of years working within Bubble, which meant that I was more than familiar with the old responsive experience. And of course, when the new Flexbox engine was released, it took me much longer than I expected to get up to speed with the new configuration settings that were available. And so what I wanted to do was create a full course that explains literally everything you need to know from my perspective about the new Bubble Flexbox engine. And this will include things like a general overview about what CSS Flexbox is, the new recommended page dimensions that you should be using for your application, how to set out the page structure and container alignment within your groups on the page, how to leverage margins as well as even collapsible groups to create fully responsive menus, and of course how to add fully responsive repeating groups into your application as well. And then finally, I also want to take the time to just walk you through the process of creating some real-world application pages from scratch using the new responsive engine. And so I'm going to be explaining how you can build not only a user registration page from scratch, but also the Instagram homepage feed on mobile, and then finally the Airbnb search results page on desktop. And throughout the process of creating these 3 separate pages, I'm going to be explaining my exact thought process and recommendations along the way. Look, there's so much that I want to cover throughout this whole course, so let's just grab our Bubble editor and dive right into it. Before I take the time to actually explain how we can start using the responsive engine, I actually just wanted to take a moment to walk us through the process of actually updating to the new engine. And so at the point in time when I'm recording this tutorial, you still currently have the option to choose between the old responsive engine and the new Flexbox engine. However, there will of course be a point where Bubble decides to deprecate the old engine, and you'll of course only have the option to use the Flexbox engine. But if you're currently using Bubble and you still have the option between the two, I'd just like to explain the process of upgrading to the new engine, and also explain some of the best practices if you have an existing application that you would like to update to the Flexbox engine as well. And so throughout our tutorial today, I just have a Notion doc here that'll just allow me to keep tabs on everything I'd like to walk through. And as you can see, the very first point that I'd like to mention is of course how you can update to the new engine. So if we were to jump over into a Bubble editor here, now I've created a brand new application from scratch, and this is the default index page that's added into any application. So the way this page is currently built in terms of responsiveness is just by adding a ton of different groups onto the page. And then it could be possible to jump over into the responsive editor, and you could set breakpoints on different groups and elements. But what you'll now see is that because this is using the old experience, we have the option here to upgrade to the new responsive engine. And now it's currently still in beta at this point. But as I mentioned, it won't be long before this becomes the default standard for any brand new Bubble application. But for our tutorial today, I'm going to explain how we can upgrade to the new version. So we're going to choose to select this button here. And then what you'll find is that a pop-up prompt will ask you if you'd like to make a copy of your page. And this is something I would strongly recommend that you do. And so from my personal experience, it's actually easier to rebuild any page using the new engine from scratch, as opposed to copying across an existing version. And the reason for this is because there's just no way to guarantee that Bubble's going to understand exactly how your existing groups on the page should be structured within the Flexbox engine. However, it still can be worth copying across your page, knowing that you will need to potentially just delete some groups and re-add them in. And if you are intending to upgrade an existing page to the new responsive editor, I would strongly recommend to create a copy of this, just so you can retain a version using the traditional editor. So that way, if you find yourself stuck within the new responsive engine, you don't completely break your whole application. So let's say if I was to want to upgrade my index page to the new responsive engine, I would make sure I have a copy of this page backed up. And then you'll also have the option here to opt in to allow Bubble to try and restructure the page to match the existing responsive behavior. In my opinion, I'm not going to select this, just because I find that the process of porting across the design structure isn't that effective. And to my point about before, I genuinely think it's easier to just rebuild your whole application from scratch using the new editor. And while that sounds like a ton of work, I'm going to be showing you a way that you can copy across the elements and the workflows to a new page in your application in a moment. But let's say I'd just like to upgrade this page for now. I'm going to click this button here. Bubble is going to work its magic in the background, and now it's going to create a copy of that page, and it's going to update it to the new Flexbox experience. And now what you'll see is that we have created a new version of our index page. And if we look at our page drop-down menu, the old version is called indexed copy. And the way that we can tell apart which one is the new responsive engine and which one is the old one is there's two quick ways. The first is that you'll see the old version here still has this little blue icon, which just prompts you to upgrade to the new responsive experience. So because this has that blue icon, that means it's currently using the old engine and can still be upgraded. Whereas our new version here, you'll see it does not have this blue icon, which just means that it's using the new responsive engine experience. And if you'd also just like to double check itself, you can just double click on the page and then open up the layout tab. And what you'll see is that this is structured in the way of the new responsive engine. So you'll find any page using the old responsive engine does not have the options that are displayed within this layout tab here. And now, as I'd mentioned, it is actually, in my opinion, easier to rebuild your application from scratch. So let's say if you had an existing page and you'd like to create a new page that is blank, and then you'd like some sort of way to copy across all of the elements and their workflows. I'm going to show you a quick way in which you can do that to save some time. And of course, if you're only just getting started with Bubble or the responsive engine itself, this might not be applicable if you haven't yet built an application. But I'd just like to take the time to quickly explain how this is possible for those who are currently using the existing engine. So let's say I'd like to create a new page within my application. I'm just going to call this test number 1. I'll choose to create this page here. And by default, this page will be using the old responsive experience. And so the reason I can tell that is because if I open up my page, you'll see that I don't have the option to access the layout menu, which is a feature of the new responsive experience. And I also have the option here to upgrade to the new responsive engine. And of course, in my responsive tab, like I'd shown you before, there's also the option here. So let's say I want to upgrade this page to the new responsive engine. And because there's no elements on this page, it's not going to ask me to create a copy of that. It's automatically just going to update the whole page itself. And now I can see that my page has been updated to the new Flexbox engine. While we're here, I'm just going to update the background color just to be a light shade of gray so I can see where it sits on my canvas. But let's say I'd like to recreate a page I have from scratch. And on the existing page of my application, let's say there is some elements that are attached to some workflows, and you'd like a way to copy those across. There's actually a super simple way you can do this. So if I was to jump over to my original index page here, and this is the one that's using the old responsive experience, and then let's say on this page I'd like to start copying across my elements, but let's say for instance there is a workflow that's attached to my button element here. So if I open this element up, what you'll see is that I have created a workflow that's triggered every single time this button is clicked. And within this workflow, I'm just opening an external website, which is the bubble.io site. But let's say instead of having to recreate this whole workflow from scratch, I'd like to have some sort of way to copy this element and that workflow across to my new page. This is actually quite easy to do. What you'll need to do is just right click on the element itself and then just choose to copy this element with its workflows. And then if you jump over into the new page that we've just created, so this is my test number 1 page, what I'd like to do is paste this element onto my page with its workflows. And so I'm going to right click anywhere on the page, and then I would like to choose to paste my element with its workflows. And what you'll now see is that this element itself has been pasted across. And if I was to open up my workflow editor, you'll see that the exact same workflow that I had previously added has also been copied across here. And now, of course, as I'll be explaining in a moment, you will need to set up some sort of page structure first before you go copying and pasting your workflows across. So the new engine still does rely quite heavily on adding groups onto the page. In fact, the new experience almost reminds me of editing a page within Elementor, which is a WordPress framework if you've never used it before. I find that the new experience is very modular in its design. So essentially you can just add a bunch of different blocks on the page, and then you have complete control as to where you'd like to position those blocks. And I personally just find that much more intuitive to use instead of just adding elements onto the page and then later on hoping that they will respond to each other. But I'm quite excited to walk you through how we can actually start building out the responsive experience. But for this very first module, I just wanted to take the time to explain how you can upgrade to the new responsive engine, and if you'd like to rebuild your page from scratch, which is what I would personally recommend. I also just wanted to explain how it's possible to also copy across elements with their existing workflows, just to save you having to rebuild each individual workflow from scratch again. Before we move on to some of the media sections of my tutorial where I'm going to talk about the page layouts and how to add elements and margins into your new editor, I actually just wanted to take the time to quickly highlight my personal thoughts on how you should structure the page dimensions within your application. And so if you're familiar with using the old Bubble responsive engine, you'd know that setting the right page dimensions at the beginning were quite critical in terms of making the overall experience responsive. So here's an example of an experience I'd created within my old Bubble engine. And essentially, if I was to take a look at the design layout of this page, what you'll see is that with the old engine, it was best practice to set the width of your page to be 1280 pixels. And the reason for this was that 1280 was not only a good size for desktop, but it allowed you to equally divide your page into different sections. So for instance, if you wanted to display 2 groups on your page, you could essentially just divide 1280 by 2 and you'd be left with 640 for each group size. And then when the page would collapse smaller than 1280, these groups would stack on top of each other. And then the same also went for if you'd like to display 4 groups along your page. You would essentially just get 1280, divide it by 4, which would leave you with 320 pixels for each group that you would lay next to each other. And of course, these would also stack once the page had reduced below 1280. And now, when it comes to the new responsive engine, in my personal opinion, I don't think the overall page width is as important as the old responsive engine. And now I feel like there's still going to be a lot of discussion around what is the ideal page width. But within my experience, I personally still like to set the page width at 960 in the new engine, not 1280. And the reason is because with the new responsive engine, it's going to take care of most of the heavy lifting in terms of the responsive stretching of elements for you. And the easiest way to explain that is just by showing you an example. So if I was to open up an editor here that is built within the new responsive experience, and if I was to click on the page itself, you'd see that the page dimensions are currently set at 960. But if I was to click into a group on the page, what you'll notice is that under the horizontal alignment option here, and I'm going to be dedicating a full module to explaining the container layouts and styles in a moment. But one thing I just want to point out is that I have set any group on this page to essentially stretch out horizontally to match the full width at any given time. So whether or not this page is 960, 1000, or 1280, this group is going to horizontally stretch regardless, so that way it will continually be responsive at any given time. And so to my point about page dimensions, as I've written down in my Notion doc here, when it comes to building out your application using the Flexbox engine, I always personally recommend that you start smaller because you can easily scale the dimensions of any groups or pages out to fit whatever dimensions the user requires. And so that's why I personally prefer, if you're building a desktop application, to start with a canvas of 960 pixels. And so even if I was to jump back into my bubble editor here, open up the responsive view here, and if I was to stretch this out to be 1200 pixels, what you'll see is that all of the groups and elements on the page have also been stretched out automatically. And that's why I do love the new responsive engine. Essentially, it's going to handle all of the heavy lifting for you. So instead of having to rigorously count how many different groups you have, and then find out the total width of your page so you can divide them by that, you don't have to worry about any of that anymore, because essentially the Flexbox engine is going to take care of all of that heavy lifting for you. One thing I would just like to point out though is that if you're building for mobile, 320 is still normally the minimum settings that I would build for. So this is the smallest size that a mobile device will be. But if you'd like to create conditions on elements to either hide or display them, I'd always recommend doing it around the 360 pixel mark, just because that's going to give you a little bit of leeway before your device actually gets to the smallest potential size. But again, if you have a page that's actually built in 320 pixels, it can easily scale out based on the horizontal alignment setting. And a great example I have is that within my editor here, I've just created a duplicate version of almost like the Instagram homepage feed. And so on this page, I just have a repeating group that displays an image as well as the details about the person who's created this post, and of course some icons to engage with this post. And now on this page, if I was to open up the repeating group itself, because I have set the horizontal alignment of this to stretch out to whatever size the page is, and so if I was to show you a preview of this application on my desktop, you'll see that this automatically looks like an Instagram web experience. So I can see the photos, the caption, as well as any additional posts within the feed. But if I was to start scaling back the size of this, it's automatically going to respond. And that's because we've set the horizontal stretch of our element just to be the maximum width of whatever size the user's device is. And now, as I mentioned, I'm going to be explaining in full detail how we can configure our horizontal alignment and settings on our page dimensions in a moment. But essentially, the whole takeaway I just wanted to explain is that within the new engine, setting the correct dimensions of your page isn't as detrimental as it used to be within the old engine. What you can do is always start smaller and scale outwards. So if you're building a mobile application, I'd recommend building the page at 320 pixels. If you're building on desktop, I'd always recommend 960 pixels, which might sound a little bit conflicting considering when you were using the old responsive engine, 1280 was the ideal page width. And so these are all notes I've added within my Notion doc here. So as I'd mentioned, you can always start smaller and automatically scale your page outwards. When it comes to the mobile dimensions, I'd recommend starting at 320. And also when you're building with desktop, I'd recommend starting at 960. And then of course, any elements will automatically scale out according to the actual size of the user's browser. Alright, so it's at this point in our tutorial that I want to move on to some of the more important pieces that we're going to cover today. And the very first thing I'd like to walk us through is the difference between all of the new page layouts and alignments of different elements. Because I personally found that this was the biggest change between the Flexbox responsive engine and the old Bubble engine. And so if you remember, I had previously mentioned that I personally believe that the new responsive engine is more of a modular experience. And so what I mean by that is you're going to have the ability to position blocks within your page and customize where they sit. And the layout and alignment of these blocks is exactly what's going to power this experience. So what you'll find is that after you've updated your Bubble editor to be the new responsive experience, and you've created a brand new page, the first thing you'll notice is that under the Layout tab, you'll have the option to choose between a container alignment. And now the container alignment is one of the most important pieces for the structure of your page or any group elements that you're going to be storing elements within. And now when it comes to the options you'll have within the container alignment, you'll see that there's quite a few. But the two that I personally only focus on myself is the row option as well as the column option. There will be some instances in which align to parent might be useful, and I'm going to be explaining those later on in our tutorial. But I'll also never use the fixed option, just because with a fixed element, you're essentially just saying that it should not be responsive. You only want it to be a fixed size or have a fixed behavior. And when we're creating a truly intuitive, responsive experience, we want the whole page to be responsive and fluid. So fixed is not really an option that I would ever choose. As I mentioned, the main two options I will normally choose between is either a row or a column. And now what these essentially mean is that as the page itself is a container, because we're going to be putting elements onto this page, the Bubble editor just wants to know how it should lay these out across the page. And if you've ever used a spreadsheet in the past, you'll understand the difference between a row and a column. A row, of course, means you're going to lay something out horizontally, whereas a column will follow a vertical behavior. And now I have a quick illustration to just show you the difference between the two. So if you were to select the container layout to be a row, it means that any elements you add onto this page are going to be structured horizontally. Whereas if you choose a column, it's going to stack each of the elements on top of each other. And on my demo page here, I've added two simple group elements onto my page, so I can show you the difference between the two. And now these are just two standard groups. I've updated the color of each so we can tell them apart from each other. But if I was to select on the overall page itself, what you'll see is that because the container layout of my page is set to be a row, Bubble is going to stack these elements horizontally across my page. Whereas if I was to select the container layout to be a column, Bubble is now going to stack these vertically. And now my personal preference when I'm building a page is to almost always use a column to stack the page. And the reason I do that on the page level itself is that when you think about an application or a website, you're going to want to build it from top to bottom. There's very few instances where you're actually going to build a page horizontally across. That's just not how websites and applications are structured. And so as you can see here with our column layout, the groups are stacking on top of each other vertically. So no matter how many elements I add onto the page, it's going to continually expand and stack more groups on top of each other. And this was something that took me a little bit to figure out with the new engine. There were in fact some pages where I thought I should set the container layout to be a row. And now the reason I came to the conclusion that the column layout was the best for the actual page structure itself is just because when I was experimenting with all of the different layout settings, I just found that when it comes to working with rows, so if I set the container layout to be a row, it's going to stack these horizontally, which means that when the page is reduced in size, the elements on this page will actually collapse on top of each other. And now this behavior of the row container allows us to create a truly responsive experience because our elements and containers are going to collapse and snap and then stack vertically when they can no longer stack horizontally. But one thing you will need to remember is that it's going to try and stack all of the elements on top of each other, which if I show you an example of a dashboard page in my application that I had created, I'm just going to preview this page here. I had actually set this page out as a row. So if I jump into my bubble editor, you'll see that the overall page container layout is set to be a row, and I have two separate groups on my page here that sit beside each other, which in theory looks great because at the moment I have two rows, they sit beside each other, and when I reduce the page, it's going to just shrink the width of each of these rows. And now I've also added a condition to hide one of the rows once the page width is below a certain number of pixels. And when I open up my page menu again on desktop, because there is enough pixels across the width to fit both of these rows, this experience actually looks quite nice. But if I show you a quick preview of what this actually looks like on a mobile device, what you'll see is that because there's not enough pixels across the width of the page, the bubble editor will automatically collapse both of these groups and then stack them vertically. And as you'll see, that just leads to the actual menu itself being disorientated on the page. Instead of being at the side, it appears at the top of the page. And that's not the kind of experience I want to create. And this is why I'll personally always try and avoid using the row option as a page layout. I'll instead always opt to set the page as a column, so that way I can stack groups on top of each other. But one thing I would like to point out is that you can always update the container layout of any other container that sits on your overall page. So if I jump back into my little test page here, what you'll see is that if I update the container layout to be a column, it's going to stack these groups vertically. But there's nothing stopping me from then setting the container layout within these to be a row. So while my page will stack vertically, any elements added within my group will now stack horizontally. And so this is why I love the new responsive experience. It gives you complete control over any particular group or element you would like, and you truly do have an unlimited amount of options when it comes to setting out the layout of your page. A good example of how to decide when you would need to set a group to be a row is of course when you'd like to stack any elements within this container to be set across the page. So for things like a header menu, or if you've got, let's say, some icons that need to be placed directly next to each other, a row layout will give you the power to lay those out horizontally. And I have a great example of how that can be used within a separate page here. So if I just open up a page that I had created, this is just a version of my website created within Bubble. And of course, all of these different colors are different groups. I personally just like to color code my groups so I can tell them apart. But if I click on the overall page here, so this is the page title, I can see that the layout of this page is a column because I want to stack everything on my page vertically. But of course, in my menu here, what I've done is I've set the group element here, so the green group at the top of my page. I've set this to be a row so that way I can control all of the text elements and the button that sit within it to be stacked horizontally and to also be positioned to the right hand side of the page. And now if you wanted to even break this down even further, just to reiterate, I have the overall layout of my page to be a column. But here on my page, I have two separate groups, one with some text and the other with an image. And of course, when this page is expanded, I want these to both sit beside each other. But when the page size is reduced, I want these to collapse and stack vertically. And so what I've done is I've added a master group here, which acts as a container. And then I've added in two separate groups within that overall container. So I've set the master group to be a row because I want both of my containers here, so the purple group and the blue group. I want them to be able to collapse when the page is reduced. And then if I click into this purple group, what you'll see is because I wanted to add elements vertically within this group, I've now stacked those vertically as a column. And if I was to preview this page here, as I mentioned, you'll see that all of the elements are currently stretched across the full width of my browser. But when I'm to reduce the size of this, what you'll see is that because this container is set to be a row, when there's not enough room for both of these groups to be displayed on my page at once, it's going to collapse those to stack them vertically. And so a great way to understand how you can choose between the different layouts is just by playing around like I have on a test page here. So if I open up my test environment, you'll see that I just added some groups to this page. And I just really recommend just playing around with positions of groups. Similar to the old responsive engine, you'll find that you will need to add quite a few groups onto the page in order to get the experience you want. And if you start to experiment around with the different layout styles of the groups, it'll also give you an insight as to how you can experiment with the alignments of these groups, which is the next thing I'd like to cover. And the alignments of our groups are going to give you even more control over the design of the overall page. So because our whole page is currently set to be the column container layout, things are going to stack vertically. But what happens if we would like to align this item in the center of our page or even to the right hand side? What you'll see is, of course, on the page itself, you'll have the option to choose the layout style, which is vertical and horizontal. But because we've selected the vertical option, in order to choose where we'll need to horizontally position any elements, you'll need to click on the container that sits on the page itself. So in this case, I've just clicked on my red group here. And the first thing I'd like to point out is not the layout style of this container, but is instead the horizontal alignment of this group. So if you see here as a reference, Bubble has identified that the parent container of our red group here is listed as a column because the parent container is our overall page itself. And because columns have the ability to stack items vertically by default, this is going to give us some additional power to choose where this horizontal alignment is positioned. So if we'd like this group to be positioned in the center, we could select this. And of course, if you'd like it in the right, you could select to align it on the right-hand side of your page. But this is what I love about the new Bubble responsive engine. So because I have my page set as a column, and then I have this group horizontally aligned in the center of my page, regardless of what size I expand my page to, this red group is now going to be positioned in the center. So if I open up my preview here, you'll see that my vertical alignment has stacked these groups on top of each other. But because I've set the horizontal alignment to be in the center, if I was to reduce the width of my browser here, you'll see that this red group will always be fixated in the middle. And that's what I love about the Flexbox engine, is that you're able to just define where you want an element to sit, and it will automatically take care of all the heavy lifting, so that way it can match that behavior. And now that's how you can manage the horizontal alignment of where your groups or elements sit on the overall page. But another powerful feature within Flexbox is the ability to update the container alignment. And by container, I mean any behavior that occurs within our red group here. So because our group is currently set to be a row, it means that any additional elements that are added into our red container here will be stacked horizontally across. And by default, let's say if I was to add a button element into this group here, what you'll see is that if I open up the layout style of our group once again, the container alignment is set to the left-hand side. But what if I would like to position this in the center of our group, so that way it's in the very center of our page? What I could do is update the container alignment of any elements that sit within our row group. And from here, you'll see that that is now centered within the actual container itself. But what would happen if I was to add more than one element into this group? Let's say I'd like to add in yet another button element. What you'll now find is that because the alignment of this container is set to the center, both of these button elements are positioned in the very center of our overall group. And this is where you'll start to see how powerful the container alignment of a row is. So while I'm using a column layout style as my overall page, if I'd ever like to display any elements across the horizontal span of my page, Using a row group is going to give me complete control as to where those elements should sit within my overall page structure. And so I'd really recommend just taking the time to familiarize yourself with all the container alignment options for your row here. So we have the ability to position our elements to the left, to the center, and of course to the right. But what you'll also see is two additional options here. One is called space around, and what this is going to do is apply an equal amount of spacing around both of these elements and between these two elements. And what that means is that regardless of how wide this group spans out, there's always going to be an even amount of space from the edges of these elements and between these two elements. And again, to my point before where I mentioned the bubble will take care of all the heavy lifting when it comes to the responsive settings, this is going to automatically make all of these elements responsive regardless of the page dimensions. And there's also another alignment option here called space between. And this is just going to assure that there is an even amount of space positioned between these two elements when they're both on the edge. And now the best way I like to interpret all of the different options between the container alignment settings here is actually through a cartoon illustration that I found on Twitter. And so this illustration identifies all of the different properties you can configure using the real-world CSS Flexbox. And of course, because Bubble's new responsive engine is built on Flexbox, this all applies. So what you can see here in our first list of options is that within our parent container here, so we can imagine that this square rectangle is our overall page, we have the option to identify the horizontal alignment of any groups that sit within it. So let's say all of these three animals were one group. We can identify if we want them on the left, the right, or the center of our page. But now let's say that we have identified where we want our overall group to sit on the page. And we just need to configure where we would like the position of those elements within our overall group to sit. This is where you'll start to see the container alignment options come into play. So you can choose to have even amount of spacing between these elements or even around these elements. And this is the exact same properties as what I just shown you. One thing I would just like to point out is that the container alignment options are only applicable if you're using a row layout style. So if I was to select our red group here, our group B, which the container layout style is currently a row, and for the alignment we have an even amount of spacing between all the elements within this group. If I was to update this to be a column, you'll see that the ability to justify the container alignment is no longer available. And that is because when you're using a column, elements will automatically stack vertically instead of horizontally. So if you'd like to move the horizontal alignments of each of these elements, you'd have to select the horizontal alignment, which I'd shown you just before. But of course, if you'd like both of these elements positioned beside each other, you'd need to, of course, choose the horizontal layout style, which is a row. And now the very last thing I'd like to point out when it comes to the alignment of our groups is that when you've selected to have your parent container as a row, it's obviously going to give you the ability to align items horizontally, but what about when it comes to aligning them vertically? So as you can see, both of these buttons are positioned at the very top of our red group here. And while I'm happy with the container alignment of the buttons positions, what I'd like to do is have these buttons move down into the center of my overall group here. And the ability to customize where this element sits within this container is actually configured on the element level itself. So if I was to click on this button, and now you can see that the parent container of this button is set as a row, which is of course our red group here. I now have the option to align this vertically within our parent group. So you can start to see that right now it's vertically aligned to the top. If I would like this centered, it will automatically move that down into the center of my group. And it's going to fix this position in the center of this group, regardless of the actual size of this group itself. So if this red group here was to, for some reason, expand to be 1000 pixels, regardless of its size, this button element will now always be positioned in the center of it. And if I'd like, I could also select our second button here. And let's say instead of positioning this in the center of our group, I'd actually like this button to expand to be the full height of this group. Under our vertical alignment settings here, there's an option to vertically stretch this element. And what this means is that once again, regardless of the size of our red group here, this button element will vertically stretch to fit the exact same dimensions of it. One thing I will just point out is that in order to vertically stretch this black button element, I'm just going to need to ensure that there's no maximum height set on this element itself. If I was to, let's say, have a maximum height of 50 pixels, it's not going to go any higher than that. So what I'd like to do is just make sure that field is blank. So right now the value should be infinite, meaning it's going to infinitely stretch to fit whatever size of the red group is on our page. And now let's say if I'd like to expand the actual overall height of our red group here, I could unselect this option here to fit the height to the content of the elements within this group. And then I could add my own custom height for this group. So let's say I want to make it 1000 pixels. I'll also just need to expand my page height as well. Just for the time being, I'm going to make this 2000 pixels. What you'll see is now our red group has expanded to be 1000 pixels high. And because we have justified the vertical alignment of our left button here to be in the center, what you'll see is that it is automatically positioned in the center of our red group here. And because our second button here had the vertical stretch configuration set on it, it's going to vertically stretch to be the full height of our red group as well. And what I'd recommend doing is just playing around with some of the different alignments within each different type of container. So as I mentioned, when it comes to using a row element, you're going to have a lot more control over the horizontal alignment of any elements that sit within it. And if you'd like to change the vertical alignment of any element that sits in a row group, you'll just need to configure that on the actual element level itself. When it comes to adding any elements within a group that is a column, however, you're going to have less flexibility over the horizontal configurations of that. So let's say if I was to make this blue group a column, and if I was to add 2 buttons into this group like I had done before, as I mentioned, these are going to automatically stack vertically. But under the layout of these buttons, you'll only have the ability to align these horizontally within the parent group. Of course, if you'd like to add any vertical spacing between these elements, you could do that by adding in some margins, but I'll be touching base on that in full details in another module in this tutorial. If I jump back into my Notion doc though, I just want to check off that I've ran us through the difference between the different style of page layouts. Just to reiterate on what I had said, I personally like to choose between the column or row option. And when it comes to the actual page itself, in almost every single case, I will choose to set the layout style to be a column. But if you'd like to customize any groups or elements within the page, I'd recommend adding some separate groups onto your column page and just setting the layout style of those groups to be a row. Just so that way you'll have full control over all the different container alignment settings that I just shown you. Now that we understand how we can structure the layout of our page and the alignment of elements within groups, what I'd like to do is start focusing on how we can actually add elements into our page, and more specifically, how we can structure different groups across our page to create a truly responsive experience. And now you might have seen before when I had shown you an example of an application I'd built using the new responsive engine, that this page was completely covered in different sporadic colors. And the reason I do this is because when I'm adding groups onto the page, I like to think of them as Lego blocks. So essentially your whole responsive experience is going to be powered by groups that stack on top and next to each other. And I'd already started to show you how that was possible in our previous module. But what this allows me to do is actually just see where those groups sit on my page. I find that if I'm editing just a blank white canvas, it's hard to keep track of where all of the different groups sit. And that's a problem that I found with most of the existing tutorials I used when I was trying to learn the responsive engine myself. I found that most of the tutorials didn't really cater to a visual understanding of the actual editor, which was actually quite challenging when you were trying to build the visual interface of your own application. And so what I'd recommend, and what I'm going to be showing you in a moment, is how I like to color code all of my different groups. And of course, when you go to preview or publish your application, you can always just update these to the original colors later on. But what I want to do within this module is show you how we can build a responsive hero section of a website. So this is just my current website that I have for my Building with Bubble brand. And on this page, I have two separate groups here. As you can see, there's the blue group and there's the purple group. And then within these containers, I've added in all of my different elements. And of course, when I'd like to either stretch or contract this page, I want these groups to respond accordingly. And so I'm going to show you how we can rebuild this section of my website specifically. And of course, later on in a separate module, I'm going to be showing you how we can rebuild entire application pages, which includes things like the menus and any other content like repeating groups. But just for now, I want us to become familiar with some of the simpler use cases for the responsive engine itself. So I'm going to open up a blank page that I have on my application here. And this is the page I had previously used to show you a demo of group positions. If you remember, I'd set the container layout of this page to be a column because it's a website page, which means I'm going to want to build this from top to bottom. So I'll be stacking all of my elements vertically. But let's say if I'm creating a hero image section, there's going to be the group on the left and the group on the right. And in order to do that, I'm going to need to somehow configure a parent group to be a row, so I can horizontally stack those next to each other. And so in order to do that, because our overall page is a column, I'm going to first need to add another group onto my page. And this group will need to be a row. So this is going to be my container element that will store both of my groups on it that will then be stacked horizontally. And so in order to identify where this group sits on my page, I'm going to head to my Appearance tab first. I'm going to remove the default style of this group and set the background color to be a flat color. I could have this be white if I would like, considering as my background is gray. I would then like this group to stretch across the entirety of my page, and I want to make sure it will continually scale based on the width of the page at all times. So if I head to the layout option of this group, I would like to first keep the container layout style to be a row, because as I mentioned, I'll be stacking groups horizontally within this. But what I'd like to do is have this stretch across the full width of my page. Now, if you remember, my page here is 960 pixels wide, but that doesn't really matter because it's going to scale at any given time if someone either stretches or retracts the size of the browser. So what I want to do is just identify a minimum width for this group. And by default, it's going to be 400 pixels. What I'd like to do though is set the minimum width of this to be 320 pixels, because that is the smallest possible size that the editor will retract to. So if you remember under our responsive settings here, a mobile device is listed as 320 pixels at its smallest possible size. And so by setting the minimum width of this group to 320 pixels, it just ensures that it won't get any smaller than a mobile device. But what I'd like to do is unselect this option here to make this element fixed width. And what you'll see is that because I have not added a maxed width into this group, it's currently set as infinite. So it's just going to infinitely stretch across our whole page, regardless of what the size is. And so if I was to just take a quick preview at what this now looks like in my actual editor, what you'll see is the gray background here is my page, and the white group here is the group that we've just configured. And now, as I mentioned, its maximum width is infinite. So it's just going to continually expand out based on the size of the page. And of course, the minimum potential width of this is going to be 320 pixels, so it won't be any smaller than a mobile device. What I would like to do back in my editor though, is add in two separate groups, which is going to split across the two different sections of my hero image. And so if I was to add in those two different sections, I'm going to need to add in two separate groups. So I'm going to add a group into my white group here. And the first thing I'm going to do is update the color of this. So I'm going to remove the style, update the background style to be a flat color, and I could set this as a light shade of red. And then what I'd like to do is actually make a copy of this group, and then I'm going to update the color of this group just to be a light shade of blue. And now what you'll see is on my overall page, which is my gray element, I have a container group, which is my white group. And then within this container, I have two other separate groups, which are going to store the content for my hero images. And now to ensure that both of these groups are positioned evenly across my white group here, I could update the container alignment of this group. So this is the white group itself, that is the parent for both these groups. I'm going to update the container alignment to be space around. And what you'll now see is that both of these groups have an even amount of space beside and between them. While I'm here, I'm also just going to update the horizontal alignment of my parent group. So once again, my parent group is the white group I'm currently editing. I just want to set the horizontal alignment to be horizontal stretch, which while I have currently set the maximum width of this group to be infinite, so it already will stretch across my page, just to ensure best practice, I also want to make sure that this setting is set to be horizontal stretch as well. But now that I've finished configuring the overall parent group, what I'd like to do is configure the two groups that sit within it. And these are going to be the groups that store the content of our hero sections. And now when it comes to these groups, because I'm going to want to stack a list of elements vertically within them, so you can see here I have 3 different text elements, what I'd like to do is update the layout style of this group to be a column, because I'll be stacking things vertically. And then while we're here, because this group sits within a row container, I have the ability to update the vertical alignment in which it sits. I'm just going to want to make sure that's centered within this group, which won't actually change anything right now. But if this white group was to expand down for some reason, I'm just going to want to make sure that this group is centered within it. And then when it comes to the width of this group, this is where I can start to create my responsive experience that's going to collapse. So because I have 2 groups within my overall container here, what I can do is set a minimum width on both of these elements. And at the moment, you'll see that the width of this group is currently set to 400 pixels, which means that if I have 2 groups here within my overall container, and both of their minimum widths is set to 400, theoretically, at the point in my page when I go below 800 pixels, which of course is 400 plus 400, these groups should collapse and then stack on top of each other. And the way I can illustrate that is by heading over into my responsive menu here. And what you'll see is that I'm currently viewing the page at 854 pixels. And of course, because we had set the container alignment to be space between, the bubble editor is automatically going to center these and make sure there is an even amount of space beside and between these 2 groups. But as you'll see, as I start to reduce the size of this and the group falls below 800 pixels, because both of these have a minimum width of 400, they're no longer going to shrink in width size. So then they're going to snap and fall on top of each other there. And that is how you can create a responsive experience using the row layout style. But what I'd also like to do is just ensure that this group is going to stretch out horizontally, because let's say I don't want any empty space in between these 2 groups. What I can do is unselect that this element is fixed width and leave the maximum width to be infinite. And then what I'll also do is select onto my second group here, so my blue group. I'm going to update the layout style to be a column because I'll be stacking elements vertically in this. I'm going to make sure the vertical alignment is centered, so it's always in the center of my original parent white container. Then I'm going to unselect that this element is fixed width. And now what you'll see is because both of these groups have a maximum infinite width set to them, they're both going to be competing for space and they're both going to be getting the same amount. And of course, once the page itself is below 800 pixels, these groups are going to snap and then they're going to be stacked vertically. And now that's how I can create the overall responsive experience for my containers here. And it's from here that we can start adding in the actual elements itself. Now I'm just going to keep things quite simple here, but let's say I'd like to add in a text element. What you'll see is that it's just going to be positioned in the top left-hand corner of our group. And if I was to replicate my own website that I had displayed here, I'm actually just going to copy this text, which just says on-demand video courses. I'm then going to paste this in within this text element. And as you'll see, because the width of this element is not long enough to fit in the actual text itself, it has collapsed that onto a new line. But if I was to jump over into my layout tab for this specific element, this is where I'm going to start to show you how you can create a truly responsive experience for your elements that sit within groups. And so what I'd like to do is expand this element to stretch across the full width of my red group here. So I'm going to unselect that this element should be fixed width. And by default, there's going to be an infinite max width. So it's just going to continually stretch across. But because it sits within my red container here, its limits are actually now the bounds of this red container's layout. So if I was to set the maximum width of this red container to be 400 pixels, the actual maximum width here for this text element would also be 400 pixels because it sits within that container. And so when it comes to responsive design in Bubble, I recommend setting the configurations on your group containers, and then all of your elements should automatically fit within those constraints. And that just saves you from having to configure each individual element separately. And so you just essentially set the configurations on your group, then add the elements into that group, and then they match those configurations. But when it comes to my text element here, what I'd also like to do is remove the minimum width of this to now be 0. And theoretically, you could make the minimum width of that 320 pixels because that is the smallest size you would find on a mobile device. But if I set the minimum width to 0, it now is limitless in terms of the minimum width and the maximum width. So that just means that it's going to be responsive regardless. And what you will find is that because there is text within this element, it will hold its position as an element. So theoretically, if I was to set the minimum width to 0, you might think that the full width of this element would just collapse and remove that text. But because it has content within it, it's going to hold its position. What I'd also like to do is just remove any of this empty space for the height of this element. And so if I was to scroll on down to the minimum height of this element, you'll see below this that we have an option here to fit the height of this element to match the content within it. But because I have a minimum height set to 45 pixels, it's leaving a space there. If I was to set that to 100 pixels, you'd see it would add even more spacing. But if I set the minimum height to be 0, it's going to fit nice and snug around my text because we have selected this option here to fit the height to content. And now that's something I would recommend for any element you add on a page or within a group. This is how you can create a truly responsive vertical experience. And now that's how we can add one text element into our group here. If I was to want to add another text element, I could just copy our existing one here, paste in the new option, and it's automatically going to paste across all of the same settings and configurations as the element above it there. If I would ever like to change the position of where this element sits within my group, I could always just choose to reposition it under the toggle here. So I could make it the previous element, or if I would like, I could make it the next element in my group. And I don't know if you saw that because they are identical. It just moved the position of where it sits within our overall container here. But within this text element, what I'd like to do is just copy across some additional text. So I'm just going to head over into my separate Bubble editor. I'm going to copy this text, jump back over into my appearance for this element, paste that in, and I'm just going to, for the sake of this tutorial, update the style to just be the H2 default style that Bubble provides. What you will find though is that because the layout settings are all set to a minimum width of 0, a minimum height of 0, and because this is going to fit the height of the content within it, this element is now completely responsive as well. And as you can see, these elements are now responsive horizontally, and they are also responsive vertically. But what happens if we'd like to change the vertical position of these? Because our parent group here, which is our red group, is set to be a column, what we'll need to do is utilize some margins to determine where these elements are going to sit in our overall group. And margins are essentially just any spacing you add onto the top of your element. I'm going to be covering margins in much more detail in a separate module, just because there's quite a few little configurations I'd recommend learning. But for the time being, what I'd like to do is, let's say, add 50 pixels of margin at the very top of this element. What you'll see now is it has added 50 pixels there. And then if I'd like to add some spacing between these two text elements, I could simply just select the second text element here and add in, let's say, 20 pixels of margin between these. And just one small tip I have when it comes to margins is that instead of just adding a top and bottom margin on this one element, I'd recommend only adding margins to the top or adding them to the bottom, but just making sure they're consistent across all your elements. So here I've added 2 top margins to each of my elements, which just means that when I see the space, I know which element it belongs to. So I can see the space between these 2 text elements here. That space is going to belong to my text element at the bottom because the margin has been set at the top. And it's also going to be the same for our top item here. The margin itself has been added on the text element, so it's pushing it down from the top. And now it's also possible to add margins in on both sides of the elements as well. So let's say I'd like to push this element across to the right a little. I could add 20 pixels of margin. And then I could also add 20 pixels of margin on the right-hand side. And because the minimum and maximum width of this element have no boundaries at all, this element will now scale with this overall group, but it's always going to ensure that it doesn't touch the bounds of this group because there's going to be 20 pixels of margin on each side at all times. Which means that if I'd like to make my text element below this also align, I'm just going to also add in 20 pixels of margin to the left and 20 to the right. And you'll now see that they are nicely in line together. And finally, just before I show you a quick preview as to how this hero section is going to function, I'd just like to add an image element into my second group here. So I'm just going to add in an image itself. I'm going to upload a static image I have on my local device here. And once I've added that image in, I would like to configure where it's going to be aligned within our group here. So if I head to the layout style here, I'm going to choose that horizontally I would like to align this within the center of my column at all times. And now when it comes to the actual size of this image, I'm going to unselect that this element should be fixed width because I would like it to stretch across the scale of our browser regardless of how big it is. But what I'd like to do, and this is something I'd recommend whenever you're using images within the new responsive engine, is to keep this element's aspect ratio fixed, which just means that based on whatever ratio you add here, it's going to maintain those overall dimensions. And I personally just find that easier to manage rather than having to juggle between different pixel sizes. But now what you'll find is that this image is going to scale out based on the actual dimensions of the page. And if I was to now take a preview of this page, I can not only show you how all of these elements are going to scale to the full size of the page, but also how they're going to collapse once the page is below 800 pixels. Over in my preview of my application here, what you'll see is that I have my hero section of the website, in which, because it's color-coded, you can see where the 2 separate groups lie on my page. Of course, my image has also scaled accordingly because it has kept the aspect ratio that I had prompted. But if I was to now start reducing the size of this browser, what you'll see is that because there's no minimum width on the elements within our groups here, they're automatically going to resize. And because they have a set amount of margin on each side, they're never going to touch the side of our group constraints. And of course, if I was to reduce this page below 800 pixels, you'll see that these groups will now stack on top of each other, just because the minimum width of these groups was 400 pixels each. And if I was to continually reduce the size of my page here, what you'll see is that they are going to continually update, and that whole experience is now truly responsive. And now one thing I would just like to point out is how this actual page looks on a mobile device. I'd just like to display a quick screen recording of this page on my own device, which is an iPhone 13. And as you'll see, the actual structure of this page is fully responsive. But one thing I would just like to point out is that because I'm using an iPhone 13, the width of the page that fits across my screen size is a little bit more lenient to larger widths. And that's because the screen itself is bigger. Whereas one thing I'd like to point out is that if you remember in our bubble responsive engine, the absolute minimum width for a mobile device at its smallest size is 320 pixels. And if I was to preview this page under those dimensions, what you'll see is that our text and our image will be cut off. And that's because the minimum width of our group elements are still set to 400 pixels. And now the reason they're 400 pixels is because when I added those on the page, that was just the default setting. And of course, as you could see on my mobile screen recording, I was able to fit 400 pixels across the whole page. But for users with smaller device sizes, we'd also like to create an experience that's going to be responsive for them. So the very last thing I would like to do on this page is just update the minimum width for both our red and blue group here. So I've currently selected my red group. I'm going to set the minimum width to be 320 pixels. And then in order to select my blue group, I'm going to click on my image. I'm then going to select the first parent, which of course is the group itself. And then I'm going to set the minimum width to be 320 pixels. And then if I jump back over into my responsive editor here, what you'll now see is that under the 320 pixels option, all of the elements on our page are now being displayed. Back in my Notion checklist that I'm using today, I'm just going to tick off that I've walked through the process of how you can set up different elements on your page. As I mentioned, when I'm building out the actual elements on the page, I like to start adding groups in and picturing them almost like Lego blocks on my page. Of course, if you want later on, you can always remove the color of those groups. But just while you're actually building your application, I'd recommend color coding your groups so you can tell them apart from each other. And also the other main takeaway I had throughout this particular module is the importance of setting a minimum width and minimum height of your elements to be 0, and then also the height to be infinite. So that way you can allow the bubble responsive engine to take care of all the heavy lifting for you. Now that we've finished learning how we can add our elements onto the page, the next thing I wanted to touch base on was the use of margins within the new bubble responsive engine. And in my opinion, this completely simplifies the whole process of making sure your elements are not only responsive, but are also neatly aligned within their container groups. And this is actually something I had previously just touched base on in the last module within this tutorial. If you remember in my bubble editor, when I was creating the hero section of a website, I had added in some margins onto my text elements just to ensure they didn't touch the top or the size of the container group that they sat within. And one piece of advice that I just really want to reiterate is when you're working with margins, it's important to keep a consistent process in order, just so you can clearly identify what spacing belongs to what element margins. So if you remember, I had mentioned that when I'm adding margins onto an element, and if I need to space something out from a text element above it, I'll always add that margin at the top of the element, not the bottom. So if we open up the margin menu for our first text element here, you'll see that it has 50 pixels of margin at the top, but 0 pixels at the bottom, which just allows me to identify that this space here between these two text elements belongs to the second text element, because it has 20 pixels of margin at the top, but 0 pixels at the bottom. And because I'm adding my margin onto the top of every element, I can just easily identify what spacing belongs to which particular element. The other thing I'd just like to summarize is how important margins are to creating a truly fluid, responsive experience. So if I was to break the whole new Flexbox responsive engine down to one simple rule, it's that your element should have no minimum and maximum width. They should have no minimum and maximum height. You should select the option to fit the height of each element to the content within it. And then from here, you just need to add margins around it to just ensure that it keeps some nice spacing, And from here, it will automatically expand as large or as small as you would like it, and also just ensure that it doesn't go out of or touch the constraints of the container group it sits within. And this was a prime example that I had shown you. So if you remember, this text element here has no minimum width or maximum width. It has no minimum height and maximum height. And because it's going to automatically stretch to fit the size of the container it fits within, I just added 20 pixels of margin completely around it there. And that way it's just going to ensure that it sits within this same position throughout the whole responsive experience. What I do just want to show you though is another example of what I mean. And in this case, I'm going to add a list of groups on my page that will act as some card holders for user testimonials. So if I just jump back over into my website that I had created here, this is the demo I'd been showing you before. You can see here there's a list of 3 different groups with 3 testimonials on them. And if I was to scale down the size of this page, what you'll see is that these groups will automatically respond. And that's because these groups have no minimum or maximum width. And you'll see that they have the same even number of margins between each element. So that way it creates a truly responsive experience. What I want to do is just walk you through how I would do that using my own editor here now. So in order to get started, what I'm going to do is add in a group as a container on our page. So if you remember, this page's container layout style was a column. So when I add this group onto my page, it's going to stack it vertically. But now because I'm adding in 3 separate groups next to each other that I want to collapse or expand, I'm going to set the container layout of this group to be a row, because that's going to give me all of the container alignment options, which is exactly what I want. While I'm here though, I'm just going to head over to my appearance tab and remove the style of this group. I'm going to set the background color to be a flat color. In this case, I could just set it to be white. And then if I jump back into the layout menu, what I'd like to do is obviously have this group scale infinitely across the full width of our page. And so what I'm going to do is unselect that this element is fixed width. I'm going to set the minimum width of this element to be 320 pixels, because of course 320 is the minimum size of a mobile device. If I jump back into my UI builder and open this up, what you'll now see is that it is expanded entirely across my page because it has no maximum width. Just to ensure I'm following best practices, I'm also going to select the horizontal alignment to be fully stretched across our page there. And for now, I'm not going to update the container alignment. What I'm going to do though is add a group element within my existing group here. Just to differentiate between this and my other group, I'm going to remove the style of this, and I actually might keep this group white. I'm going to contradict myself, sorry, and change the color of my main group here. I'm just going to make this a shade of green. You can make this whatever color you would like. If I then click on the group that I just added, I'm going to set the background color to be a flat color, and I will allow this to be white. While I'm here, I'm also going to update the roundness of its borders to be 20, so that way you'll just see that it will have some curved edges now. And now if I was to jump into the layout style of this group, I would like to set this to be a column, because I'll be stacking some text elements within this vertically, not horizontally. And for the actual vertical alignment of this group itself, I'm going to always want this to be centered vertically within my green group. So if I was to click on my green group here and unselect that I want to fit the height of this element to the content within it, what you'll see is that this white group will now be centered vertically regardless of its size. I'm just going to tick that option again though, because I'd still like to make a few more changes to this group here. So I'm going to click on my white group that I've just added, and I'm going to unselect that this element should be fixed width, and I'm going to select that the minimum width of this should be 320 pixels. So that way at the smallest size it could possibly be, it's going to be the right dimensions for a mobile device. What I would like to do now though is add some margins around it. So this group is currently touching the green group itself. So what I'm going to do is set a margin at the top to be 10, a margin at the bottom to be 10 pixels. And then I'm also going to add a margin of 10 pixels to the left and right hand side of this group. And now what you'll see is that because this group has a minimum width of 320 pixels and an infinite maximum width, it's going to continually stretch out, but at any given time, it is not going to touch the parent group's container because it has 10 pixels of margin all around it. And now let's say I'd like to add in the actual text of this testimonial itself. I can choose to add a text element into my white group. For this text, I'm just going to jump over into my bubble editor here and copy across what I had previously added. I'm going to paste that in. If you would like, you could just add in whatever text you would like. You can always grab some lorem ipsum dummy text if you would like. But for the layout style of this text, I'd like to leave the horizontal alignment to be left because I want this to be read from left to right. I'm going to unselect that this should be fixed width because I want this text element to expand out regardless of the size of the group it sits within. And then for the minimum width and height, I'm going to set these both to 0, which just means it's not going to have any constraints as to how small or large this text element will be. It's always going to adapt to the size of the user screen. And then I'm going to add in 10 pixels of margin all around this element here. So once again, it is no longer going to touch the actual border of the white group it sits within. And now that we've finished adding in the text element, let's say I'd like to add in the image of the person who submitted this testimonial, as well as the name and their job title. What you'll see here is that these elements are both horizontally positioned against each other, which means that they're sitting within a group, which is a row, not a column. So if I was to jump back into my bubble editor here and click on my overall white group, you'll remember that this is set out to be a column because I want to stack some text elements on top of each other. But that doesn't mean that within this column, I can't add a group that's a row and then stack elements horizontally. So if I was to select to add in a group into our existing white group here, and just to separate this, I'm going to remove the style of it, update the background color to be a flat color, and then I could set the background color here just to be a light shade of yellow. This group is going to be set as a row, so I need to head over to the Layout tab, set this out to be a row, which means I can now stack elements in this horizontally. But before I do that, what I'd just like to point out is that I'd like to add some margin on this element, just to ensure it never touches the boundaries of the white group it sits within. And so I'm going to add 10 pixels of margin to the left-hand side here, 10 pixels to the right, and then 10 pixels to the bottom. I also realized that I have contradicted myself in that I had added 10 pixels of margin to the bottom of the text element above it there. As I mentioned before, it is always best practice if you can keep your margin consistent. So instead of adding 10 pixels at the bottom, I'm going to click on my yellow group here and add 10 pixels at the top of it. And then what I'm going to want to do is update the configurations of this group to stretch all the way across our white group it sits within. So I'm going to unselect that this element should have a fixed width. And then I'm going to set the minimum width of this to be 0. And then before I set the minimum height to be 0, I'm going to need to add the elements I'd like to display within this group. So as you saw before, I'd like to display a profile photo as well as the name and job title of a person who has left this testimonial. So if I was to add an image element into our overall group here, I'm just going to upload a static image that I have. And while we're here, I'm just going to edit the dimensions of this image. I'm going to set the roundness to be 100, so it's a perfect circle. I'd then also like to keep this element as a fixed width because I don't want this image to continually scale up or down. I just want it to be a fixed small circle. So I'm just going to select that I want the width of this to be 60 pixels. And then I'm also going to select that I want the minimum height of this to be 60 pixels. Because I don't want this element to stretch, I want it to be a fixed height as well. And then beside our image here, I would like to add 2 text elements. One that will be the name of the person who has published this testimonial. and then another which will be the job title of that person. And if I was to jump over into my separate bubble editor here, what you'll see is that these text elements are both stacked vertically, not horizontally. And of course, when you're stacking elements vertically, you're going to need to use a column group. So this means I'm going to need to add another group within my yellow group here, and I'm going to need to set the value of that to be a column layout style. So if I select another group here, what you'll first notice is it's going to stack that horizontally, which is exactly what we want. I'm then just going to head over to my appearance tab here. I'm going to remove the style of this and update the background color to just be a flat color for now. And that'll just allow me to see where it sits within our overall yellow group. I'm going to then jump over to my layout tab here and select that this will need to be a column style because I would like to stack the elements in here vertically. I'm going to, of course, unselect that this element should have a fixed width because I want this to scale out to be the full size of the main white group here for our testimonial card. And then I'm going to set the minimum width of this to be 0. And now I can start to add in the text elements I would like to display. So the first one is just going to be this person's name. I'm just going to add my own name in here for now. And when it comes to the layout of this element, what I'd like to do is add some margin between it and my profile image there. So on the left-hand side, I'm going to add 10 pixels of margin. And then I'm also just going to update the minimum height here to be 0. So that way, because I have my setting here, which fits the height to content, it's automatically going to scale that down. When it comes to the horizontal alignment of this element, I'm going to want it positioned to the left. And then for the width of this element, I'm going to unselect that this should be fixed width and just set the minimum width of this to be 0. So that way it's infinitely going to scale exactly where I'd like it. And then I'm going to copy this text element because within this text element, I would like this to display the job title of this person. So I'm just going to say product manager. I just made a small typo there. And if I would like, I could open up my rich text editor and choose to bold the format of this text just so it stands out. And what I'd also like to do is just add some margin between my two words here. So I'm just going to head to the layout tab of my job title element, and then I'm going to add 10 pixels of margin at the top. And now what I can do is actually update the configurations of all of the groups that these elements sit within. So I'm going to start by selecting my white group here. I can see the minimum height is 250. What I'm going to do is set this to 0, and you'll see it'll automatically collapse and fit around the title element that sits within it. And then the next group I would like to configure is my yellow group. And so I'm also going to set the minimum height of this to be 0. And then finally what I'd like to do is select my overall white group here, which was the actual testimonial card itself. And so for this, I'm going to set the minimum height of this to also be 0. And now you'll see we have a nice testimonial across our page. And not one of the elements touches the actual border of the card it sits in itself. If I'd really like to just polish this experience up, I could click onto my yellow group here, which of course is my row that my profile photo and my text elements sit within. I could just update the appearance of this to be white, so that way it fits in with the actual card itself. But now what I'd like to just remind you of is that within our overall testimonial card here, we had set the minimum width and height of this to essentially have no boundaries. And so the only rule we've set to this group element is that the minimum width should be no smaller than 320 pixels, which of course is the minimum width of a mobile device. But because it has a maximum width, it's going to stretch out regardless of how much space it has. But let's say I'd like to add in 3 testimonials and I want them to all scale accordingly to our page. What I can do is select the actual card itself, make a copy of this, and then paste another version of it in. And because it's going to copy across the exact same properties, this card is going to stretch out to fit whatever space it has. And because it has 10 pixels of margin on each side, it is not going to touch our overall parent group, which is our green group. If I was to want to paste in another card, I could click within my green group here and choose to paste in another testimonial. And what you'll see is that these elements here, because our minimum width is set to 320 on our groups, if the page cannot fit more than 2 groups, it's going to automatically scale that below on a new row. And that is because we had in fact set the container layout of our overall green group to be a row, which just means it's going to collapse accordingly. And if we were to take a preview of this testimonial experience, what you'll see is over in my bubble editor, when I have the page stretched out to a full scale, you can see that it's comfortably going to be able to fit 3 different testimonial blocks. But let's say I'd like to reduce the width of this page. What you'll see is that it will start to reduce the actual width of each group element. And once it reaches a point where it can no longer scale any lower than 320 pixels, it's going to snap that group onto another row there. And if I was to continually scale this down, what you'll see is that it will snap again. And of course, it won't go any smaller than 320 pixels in width. And the reason why I wanted to show you how to build a similar experience to this is because it's not only great practice for understanding how you can add and manipulate different group types on your page. So if you remember, we had our column group and then we had a row group within that. And then finally, our text elements sat within another column group. That of course was within another row. But it also just shows you the power of margins within Bubble. And of course, I've said it before, but I'm going to say it again. In order to create a truly responsive experience, you should set the minimum and maximum width to essentially be none, or have a minimum of 320 pixels to cater for a mobile device. You should have the minimum and maximum height set to 0. And then you should only just need to add margins around your elements, and they will scale accordingly across your editor. Back in my Notion checklist, I just want to tick off that I've explained the process of how you can start to add margins around your elements. But before we move on, there's one very last thing I'd like to show you, and that is how you can create conditions for your margins. And I have a particular use case and example that I'd like to show you within this tutorial today. If I was to jump back into my bubble editor here, I've created a page that's almost just like a form that essentially just allows someone to list a property on a marketplace like Airbnb. And what you'll see here is that under the amenity section, I have a list of checklist items that a user can select from. And the way I've structured this amenity checklist is that I have an overall container group, which is a row, and then I have 2 column groups within that row. So that way I could stack each of these checklist items vertically. One thing I'd like to point out though is that when this page is reduced below a certain width, because this overall container is a row, it's going to collapse this group that sits within it below. And if I show you what that looks like in my responsive editor here, you'll see that when this group collapses, because it's stacking 2 groups on top of each other, there's actually no spacing between this group here. So that just creates an experience where these 2 elements are now attached together. But what I'd like to do is, of course, create a condition that just recognizes when this group breaks into 2 and then stacks them vertically on top of each other. I'd like to add a condition that adds some padding at this size, so that way it can maintain a consistent spacing between the 2 groups. And so what I'd like to do is just show you how we can create a similar experience, except we're going to add a condition onto this group that just adds in some conditional padding. And now what I'd like to do is actually just build this from scratch. So if I just head over to a test page I have in my application here, what I'm going to do is add in my own checklist menu below. So I'm going to start by adding in a group element like before, and this is going to be our parent container group. I'm going to choose to remove the style of this, set the background color to be a flat color, and then I'd like the layout style of this to be listed as a row, because I of course want to display 2 separate groups within it. I'm going to leave the width of this element to be fixed, because I want my amenities option to constantly be positioned on the left-hand side of my page. I don't want it to scale infinitely based on the actual browser size. I'm always going to want it to be the same size in my page. So I'm just going to leave this set as 400 pixels. So I'm just going to leave this set as 400 pixels wide, and then I will leave this as a fixed element. For the time being, I'm just going to leave all my alignment settings as they are as well. And then within this, I'm going to add 2 separate groups. And these are of course going to be our groups that will display our checklist. And once I've added that group in, I'm going to head to my Appearance tab. I'm going to remove the style of it. I'll update the background style to be a flat color. I'll set this group to be red. And because I want this group to be half the size of our overall group, if I jump over to my layout settings, I'm going to want the width of this group to be 200 pixels wide. But before I do that, I'm going to need to update the container layout style. I'd like this to be a column because I'll be stacking some text elements vertically in this. I'm then going to set the width of this to be 200 pixels. And this of course will be a fixed width because I want it to maintain its overall width size. And then if I would like, I could start adding in my checklist items within this group here. So I'm going to select to add in a checkbox element. And I'm just going to want this one to say washing machine. I can see I just have a small typo there. And what I'd like this element to do is actually stretch out to be the full width of the red group it sits within. So I'm going to head to my layout menu. I'm going to unselect that this element is fixed width, meaning it will have an infinite max width. I will also set the minimum width to be 0, the minimum height to be 0, and just make sure the option is checked here to fit the height of this element to the content that sits within it. What I could do is also add a margin of 10 pixels to this element, so that way it's just not touching the top of the container it sits within. And then if I would like, I could copy this text element. It's going to copy across all of the same properties, so it's going to keep the margin within it, and also the minimum and maximum height and width of it as well. And then let's say I'm going to add 2 more copies of this just for the sake of our tutorial. But now what I'd like to do is make a copy of this red group, and that will contain our next list of checklist items that will sit beside it. Before I do that though, I'm going to click on my red group here, and I'm just going to reduce the actual height of this element itself. So I'm going to set the minimum height here to be 0, and now it will automatically fit nicely around all of the elements that sit within it. I'm then going to make a copy of this group, and because it sits within a container that is a row, it will automatically position horizontally in our container there. And one thing I would just like to point out is that the width of this group is also 200 pixels. So if at any point the page is below 400 pixels, which is the total value of both of these groups combined, it's going to collapse onto a separate line. And just to illustrate that, I'm going to update the color of this group as well. So I'm going to head to the Appearance tab here, and then I'm going to update the color of this to be a shade of green. And one thing I would just like to point out is that I just realized I'm going to need to contradict myself. So I'd added a margin of 10 pixels on the first text element within our group here. What I'm going to want to do though is actually just remove that for the sake of our tutorial, just so I can show you how the condition works. So if I just head to the layout of our first text element within the group, I'm just going to set the margin of this to be 0. And then I'm going to need to do the exact same thing for the same text element within our green group. So I'm going to click on the very first text element, and then I'm going to set the margin of this to be 0 at the top. And now before we preview this within our responsive engine, there's one last thing I'd like to do, and that is just remove the height of the parent group that both of our column groups sit within. So if I click on the overall white group here, which is set to be a row, I can see that we have the configuration checked to fit the height of this element to the content that sits within it. And so what I'll do is just remove the minimum height constraint there, and then it's automatically going to rescale to the size of the 2 groups within it. And now if I jump over to my responsive engine here, what you'll see is when I reach 400 pixels in page width, this group here is going to break onto a separate line because both of our featured groups within it are 200 pixels wide. And so at the point of 400, there's not going to be enough room for both, so they're going to collapse onto a new line. So let's drag our page in. I'll just scroll on down again. And you'll start to see that at 400 pixels here, it's going to split this group onto a separate line. But what you'll see now is that there's currently no space between these two groups. And so the very last and very first checkbox items in both of our groups are now attached together. And so what we can do onto our green group here is create a condition that recognizes when the page is below 400 pixels in width. And in that case, we're going to add 10 pixels of margin onto our group. So I'm going to select onto my checkbox item here. I'm then going to right click and choose to select the first parent of this element. And now the parent is going to be our green group. And then what I'm going to do on our green group is head to our conditional tab. I'm going to define a new condition, and then I'm going to type in the word width, and I'm going to choose the option here that identifies when the current page width, and then I'm going to select is less than followed by the number 400. So when the current page width is smaller than 400 pixels, I would like to select that I want to add some top margin, and I want this top margin to be 10. And now you'll see that's going to add 10 pixels of margin, and it's going to split our groups apart. What you'll then see is when I expand my page back out and this group collapses back to its horizontal position, that condition is no longer true because the page width is above 400 pixels. So it just removes that margin, but it'll only display it when it's needed, of course when our page is now below 400 pixels. And if I jump back into Notion, I'm just going to check off that we've walked through the very last feature that I wanted to cover within this module. And that just explains how you can add conditions for margins across different elements in your editor. And that is all I have time for within this tutorial today. If you are interested in watching the rest of the course, I'd recommend hitting the link in the description to get access to that. Throughout that course, there's over 5 hours of content where I explain everything else you need to know about mastering the new Bubble responsive engine. That'll include things like how you can work with collapsible groups to create fully responsive menus, as well as how to make fully responsive repeating groups across any device size. And in particular, that was one of the harder things that I had to learn myself when it came to the new responsive engine. So watching that within the full course is definitely going to save you a ton of time having to learn that yourself. And then finally, at the end of the full course, I'll be explaining how we can build some real-world application pages from scratch. And that'll include things like a user login page, the Instagram homepage feed, as well as the Airbnb search results page. In the meantime though, if you wanted to check out any additional Bubble resources, I recommend heading to my channel and hitting the subscribe button just to make sure you stay up to date with any of the new content that I publish. But that's all from me today, and of course in the meantime I wish you all of the best on your own no-code journey.